Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Midweek Wire. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Thank you for joining us. We had a fantastic Sunday Wire broadcast. If you missed it on the weekend, we'll talk a little bit about that because this is really a run-on discussion, an extension of what we covered on Sunday. And I'm going to be joined by a very special guest. We're navigating some very tricky waters here, ladies and gentlemen. So we need the best minds available, and I think we have one of them who I'm going to bring on to the program right now. He is an author, and he is also an international human rights lawyer, political consultant. He has a lot of experience in the Middle East, especially, and particularly a great knowledge of Syria, both politically, broadly, and also on the ground in the country as well. Very well steeped in what's going on, so I can't think of anybody better to bring on to the program than Arnaud Develay. Arnaud, thank you for joining us this week on the Midweek Wire.
Hello, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
No, it's our pleasure, Arnaud. And there's a couple of big things that I wanted to talk to you about. First of all, because of your expertise in international law, there's a big story that has arisen. This was on the cards for a while. And that is that the United States was always making threats against the International Criminal Court. Should they, pursue any American, or it seems to be any ally of America, and one particular ally, a special ally, the state of Israel, with the arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. This is all coming to a head finally. And it's really, I don't think this is going to go well for anybody personally, and we'll talk about that. Donald Trump and Israel's war on the ICC, but also there are just huge and important developments on the subject of Syria. And I know this is something that you really want to get into, and we'll do that. First, though, let's talk about the situation with the ICC. We'll bring this program up on stage right now. This is the article which we have at 21st Century Wire, The Empire Strikes Back. We've got a very, let's say, colorful illustration here, thanks to our team. Thank you very much. But that's Donald Trump and Karim Khan, who is the head prosecutor, British as it goes, at the ICC. And basically, according to Trump's order, okay, and so the groundwork was laid in February for this. The International Criminal Court's, quote, malign conduct threatens the sovereignty of the United States and undermines the critical national security and foreign policy work of the U.S. government. In other words, if you indict an Israeli official for war crimes, this is threatening the sovereignty of the United States and the critical foreign policy work of the U.S. government. That's debatable. So that was the opening salvo. And it's now sort of come to a head. We'll talk about this. Karim Khan, his email account has now been disabled. His bank accounts have been frozen. Other staff members of the ICC cannot enter the United States. They have all been effectively sanctioned via executive action by the United States. I mean, this is something, okay? And there's the picture. That's Karim Khan. So he cannot continue work on this case, Arnaud. So this has real-world implications. It's preventing the advancement of this legal case against the Israeli leadership for war crimes. So, pardon me, Arnaud, but I didn't see this type of protest against the ICC when they issued warrants against Vladimir Putin and another leading Russian official in 2023 for supposedly kidnapping thousands of Ukrainian children. That story was, of course, widely debunked, but no pushback from the U.S. In fact, they cheered that on, if I'm not mistaken, specifically Lindsey Graham. But now the ICC is a globalist enemy institution because they are prosecuting Israeli officials over what the ICJ and many other countries in the UN General Assembly and so forth, the wide consensus, Arnaud, is that this is a genocide. We don't need to wait 2 years for a ruling on that. So this is where we're at, Arnaud. I think this is a hugely dangerous development because these are, whether you agree with all of their actions or not, these are institutions that create the framework for international law. And if they're undermined or attacked or canceled, what do we have at that point? I'm going to hand it over to you and your thoughts on this story, Arnaud.
Yes, well, I guess this was long in coming. Let's put things back in perspective for our viewers and listeners. The ICC is actually a treaty-based institution, so it is somewhat related to the UN in as far as the Rome Statute, Rome Treaty being filed with the International Secretariat. It is not a UN organ per se. It is, however, the culmination of one could say at least 80 years, some would say more, of organically developed international criminal law, which had, I guess, a boost in the wake of the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg trials, which were the first to basically refuse the defense of command responsibility, or at least I was obeying order kind of defense, basically. But in so doing, it opened a whole can of worms. We all remember the admonishment of Robert Jackson, then the Nuremberg chief prosecutor, who basically warned those participating in those proceedings that if they were to be tempted to engage in what was called then victor's justice, they might open a Pandora box, which would see down the road, to be sure, some of those very participants being on the other side of the dock. And there we are. The ICC per se was thus the culmination of a development of international criminal law. It has integrated in its jurisprudence, of course, customary international law, but also many of the decisions that were adopted, for better or for worse, some would say, by the ad hoc tribunals during the 1990s. Let's recall that the 1990s saw more work, an ad hoc institution of that kind being put together in about a decade or so, if we take into account the remnant mechanisms. Then all of the 7 decades preceding the 1990s. And so the ICC was to be this kind of permanent international court, which by the time it was ratified in 2002, got into the statute became effective in 2002 upon ratifying by 60 UN member states. And as of today, I think there's about 123 countries. Obviously, initially during the 1990s, the court, the ICC project, had the backing of the United States. I guess with the understanding that this institution could be a tool to promote the US determination of who's good and who's bad, to make a long story short. But then we somewhat quickly started seeing that some, if not some countries, at least some regions of the world seem to be getting the brunt of the ICC, whereas others, i.e., the international community, as it were, quote unquote, were somewhat getting a free pass. And so there was increasingly criticism, justified criticism, in my opinion, of the ICC. And so I guess since the institution itself is constantly looking for funding to, maintain functioning, it had to somehow succumb to the politics of it. Let's recall also that in 2002, when George W. Bush became president, he immediately, so first to be sure, the US never ratified it, the Senate never ratified the Rome Treaty, so the US never was a member member state, signatory of the Rome Treaty. But to make matters even more clear to those who might have had doubts about one day getting the US to come on board, George W. Bush had his Congress, his majority in Congress, adopt the 2002 Hague Invasion Act, which was complemented by the what's called the SOPAs, updated version of Statute of Force agreements with key U.S. allies, so as to insulate U.S. service members from being prosecuted and being essentially shipped to The Hague. And the Hague Invasion Act, as the name indicates, basically predicated that were somehow U.S. service members to be transferred to The Hague for prosecution, the U.S. took it upon himself to literally exfiltrate them by force. So the first red line was somewhat starkly defined right there. And so the ICC somewhat attempted to navigate through within the confine of this red line, but it still could count on the membership of some of the key EU countries. And so in that respect, I guess it satisfied itself with that state of affairs. The Russian Federation never joined. The Popular Republic of China never joined. Israel never joined. India never joined. So that's important when we look at the current geopolitical configuration, which basically shows that a significant amount of the world's population represented by those countries are not on board. It's really somewhat of a EU endorsed institution, which by and large has been going after African potentates or lord or militia members or African heads of states who were deemed to somewhat have defied the conditions under which they had been tolerated to run such and such country. We can recall, for instance, Laurent Gbagbo, former Ivory Coast president, who for a while, was in the West white papers, little white papers, so to speak, until he decided that he wanted to somewhat express sovereign tendencies, and so they somehow weaponized the court, and after many years of protracted proceedings, he was essentially acquitted of all the charges that were against him. We saw also in Libya that the ICC issued warrants against Saif al-Islam, the son of the late Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi. And since the statute is, one of the most fundamental principles of the statute is predicated on what's called a complementarity. So the ICC, as it were, takes into account the sovereignty of countries to the extent they are not either able or willing to prosecute some individuals identified as having presumably committed some of the key criminal offenses that are defined by the Charter. So war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. And in the wake of the 2010 Kampala Accord, which came into effect in 2017, the crime of aggression, which is interesting in a way because we'll get back to it later, I guess. There's this kind of completely UFO-like device that's been promoted by the European Union to go after Vladimir Putin and his entourage on the crime of aggression in as far as the events in Ukraine are concerned. But aggression is actually contained, in the ICC statute. It's Article 8. So it's somewhat interesting to see what justification the EU used to come up with their own tribunal, which, short of being endorsed by a veto-free UN Security Council resolution, has no ground to exist in the first place. But I guess we're dealing with political communication here and trying to get population living in those EU countries on board as to the real nature of those people, those bad guys. That's my take, at least.
What's interesting is Britain, the UK. Let's face it, that is America's right hand in Europe. Usually, they're a signatory to the Rome Statute. So, and in fact, the lead prosecutor on this case with Netanyahu is in fact British, Karim Khan, who has done the bidding, you could say, of the globalists or the international deep state interests with the prosecution of people like Vladimir Putin. I mean, we'll bring the world leaders up here. I mean, yeah, it is. Up until a couple of years ago, Arnaud, it was all black African leaders, and they only just recently. I mean, in terms of DEI, Vladimir Putin shattered the glass ceiling. He's the first white guy to ever be indicted by the ICC. So, in the spirit of great DEI spirit of Europe, Vladimir Putin has broken through that glass ceiling. And then Benjamin Netanyahu, who was also indicted in 2024. And then they've gone for Rodrigo Duterte. And that case looks very, very sketchy, to be quite honest. Former president of the Philippines. You can see him on the upper right-hand corner of this list here. But, the most high-profile catch is really Omar al-Bashir. That has to be one of the biggest ones. And then you've also got the, as you mentioned, former president of Cote d'Ivoire, Laurent. Can't pronounce his. Yeah, Gbagbo.
Laurent Gbagbo. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a few others that are not on this list. It's quite interesting. When I was in The Hague, Arnaud, I remember walking into the reception of the ICC, and they have their Hall of Fame up on the wall. As soon as you come into reception, just on the left is the pantheon of war criminals, and all black faces. When I was there in I think it was 2018, and I was straight away. It was very peculiar just to let that sink in. But I learned something when I was in there being briefed by the ICC for my postgraduate work and research, that the United States has their agents implanted in The Hague, on a, not as for observer status, and also as intermediaries in Eurojust with Europol, etc. So they have their key people. They're in key positions in the ICC. So even though the United States is not a signatory, one can argue that they have great, let's say, they've penetrated that institution, and also the political pressure they apply can steer the decision making in many ways, and the funding. And here we have a perfect example, Arnaud, threats of sanctions, and then going after the lead prosecutor. I mean, where's the outrage from Britain, Arnaud, from France, from all these other European countries that are signatories to the Rome Treaty?
Well, I mean, yes, a few things to unpack here. So it's interesting because Karim Khan was actually vetted by, let's be honest, by the somewhat pro-Zionist crowd as someone who was amenable, let's put it this way, acceptable as such. And what happened is that when the Ukraine conflict started, the ICC was on the ground almost immediately in spring 2022, getting the red carpet, literally getting access to all the alleged war crime scenes. And up until that point, including the issuance of warrants against Vladimir Putin and a couple of individuals associated to this alleged case of relocating children against their will, kidnapping children, essentially. This is how they framed it, from war zone areas into areas where they could develop as children. Karim Khan was riding hard with it. There was actually, probably to the extent you're referring to those US operatives there, it looked as if, happy days were here again. And then October 7th happened. And for quite some while, the ICC was mum, and the pressure started building and building. And obviously, the contrast couldn't be more stark in as far as going after the president of the Russian Federation and allowing, the principles in the, as you said, consensually accepted now genocide going on in Gaza to basically be left unscathed. And so I think that pressure adversely put the ICC back in the spotlight as somewhat of an imperialist construct. And so Karim Khan found himself, I guess, facing a dilemma. Should I just stand pat and play along like anybody else does on this particular file, or should I, at least go along, go through the motions of what a prosecutor is supposed to be doing? And this is what he opted to do, basically, is to, under relenting pressure, media pressure, NGOs pressure, grassroots movement, he relented and he initiated investigation, preliminary investigation. And he invited everyone who was able to do so to provide his office with, evidence. And evidence was overwhelming, as it were, to such degree that I think it was late last September, late summer last year, his office basically forwarded his case for referral to a 3-judge panel who had to basically decide whether or not there was ground to issue international warrant. And so there was a lot of maneuvering behind the scene from the Israeli side, which is interesting in a way, because if the Israelis had been somewhat studying Jacques Vergès' strategy in political cases, they would not even have given him the time of day. But by sending people there and trying to basically call into question the legitimacy of the court to pronounce judgment, or even barely to initiate any kind of investigation bearing on Israeli leaders, they were giving the court the legitimacy that it lacked. So that basically was kind of a boomerang effect. But to be sure, ultimately that 3-judge panel, after I think about 7 or 8 months of wrangling, basically gave the green light to Karim Khan. So if we look at it this way, I mean, the US sanctions against Khan's office make no sense. I mean, either you sanction the entire court or you don't do anything, because now somewhat limiting your sanction and your retributions against the prosecutor of the ICC when the warrants were validated by sitting judges makes no sense. But so essentially, yes, as you say, now the Karim Khan is essentially a haunted man. He's been debanked, although this was revealed like a couple of days ago. Nobody knew about the extent of the persecution against him. And alongside him, I think we're talking about no less than 900 staff who are concerned by those sanctions, including many Americans, professionals. So this is where we are. But to be sure, while this sequence, those developments are not that surprising coming from Washington, D.C., let's keep in mind that the Europeans, who are themselves held to facilitate and make it possible for people affected by international warrants to be arrested and sent to The Hague. A country like France, for instance, allowed Netanyahu's plane not once but twice to cross its airspace. And more recently, Netanyahu was on a state visit, I believe, to Hungary.
Right.
And there was a lot of controversy about whether or not, Hungary would be fulfilling its obligation as. So we're going to get into this, because Hungary says that they never ratified it.
Right.
But if we look at, the the Vienna Convention, as far as the understanding of international law, the basics, it's all about good faith, right? So if you sign on an international treaty, you cannot invoke an internal disposition to somehow justify why you're not following up, on your obligations, on said obligations.
Right.
And this was essentially Hungary's arguments going back to 2001, when they, after being open for signature, they joined and they signed, but they never ratified it because they invoked constitutional problem if they were to integrate the Rome Statute into their laws, into their domestic laws. But again, they've had they've had almost a quarter of a century to cure and to remedy to those constitutional provisions, to a constitutional obstacle, of the constitutional nature, and they haven't done so. So it's somewhat kind of hard to believe that Hungary was serious, ready to play ball to begin with. And sure enough, we just learned yesterday that so it would take a year for the process to be complete, but the Hungarian parliament essentially adopted a bill putting into effect the statements of Viktor Orban, bearing on Hungary leaving the court allegedly because of its political politicization.
Well, it seems to be a single issue, and it's the state of Israel. And if it was a close U.S. ally, they could use the same line of argument as Hungary has with Israel. That was announced during Netanyahu's state visit, and many believe, Arnaud, that was the reason why Netanyahu did a state visit to Hungary at this crucial time, because he wanted to get that result politically and then show the rest of Europe that, encourage other countries to withdraw from the ICC, to delegitimize the ICC, to lessen the severity of this case against him. And to some degree, let's face it, it worked. I didn't, France or the UK or, some of these countries, I don't know exactly where they stand, but some people in the UK are saying they would exercise the arrest warrant on the ICC with Netanyahu and Gallant. But these are European countries that this is one of their bedrock institutions, Arnaud. This is one of the main collection of institutions that defines Europe as a liberal, democratic kind of confab, if you will. So the fact that they're throwing this all under the bus for one country that's not even in Europe is quite extraordinary, and I think it really speaks to the power. But I'm going to bring this back to Donald Trump here. So I think this might seem like a cost-free maneuver within the U.S., Arnaud, but is it really? Is this a cost-free kind of move by Trump? Because if you're thinking about it just in terms of domestic talking points and, we're taking it to the globalists, they love doing this grandstanding act in Washington on the Republican side, especially. But these are some major allies that the U.S. has that are signatories to this. So by trashing the court, plus the people working in it, many of whom are from these other countries that are signatories, is this an own goal by the United States? I mean, this could have some consequences, no?
Well, I mean, I think it's an own goal as far as the West as a whole, as far as the, whatever you want to call it, the rule-based order, the unipolar. We're witnessing essentially through that sequence the last heaving remnants of the unipolar moment. And the ICC was supposed to be the pinnacle of the unipolar moment. And there we are a quarter century later, and it's almost looking like a grotesque caricature now. So I would say the US is in its role in as far as providing unconditional support, but in Europe, obviously, it's a little more difficult for them to swallow. Although you have to keep in mind that when we talk about a foreign country, every single one of those countries is heavily, heavily infiltrated and under the influence of Zionist lobbies. I mean, in France right now, for the last 19 months, the mere fact that you would sympathize with the people undergoing, such atrocities makes you an apologist of terror. And this is actually the criminal appellation of what you will be charged with, apologie du terrorisme. So you're not even, in a way, allowed to be neutral or to somewhat show empathy to the victims, because fundamentally, and this is what the Zionist lobby promoted talking heads on French TV keep saying, essentially in filigrane, is that they are the victims and the other victims don't count. So there's such a, right now it's almost like a juggernaut. It's very difficult. People are really scared in France. This has really polarized, the country. I mean, in as far as being able to express oneself on this, but also, to be sure, on the Russian-Ukraine file as well. But the events in Gaza have really taken it a notch in such unprecedented fashion that now we can, by and large, say that free speech is, was kind of moribund in France, but now it's really dead. And a lot of people have been arrested and placed in basically on remand for months at a time on offenses who would have been qualified not that long ago as délit de presse, which basically, it's basically you're writing an opinion in a media organ, whether it's print or whether it's a video, and then you fall under the umpire of what's called the law of 1901 on regulating the press, Article 24, which is incitement to hatred. And they've been using this as essentially the predicate. They've been adding the apology of terrorism, which goes back to 2015 after the attacks on the Bataclan. And now they're arresting people left, right, and center just by merely trying to show even-handedness in the treatment, the media treatment of what's going on in Gaza, and call a spade a spade. That can get you basically raided at 6 a.m. and put in jail for upward to 2 to 3 months until somehow you see a judge and hear what charges are held against you. So in that sense, everybody is tetanized, and I guess the whole thing goes all the way to the top, where Netanyahu decides to go to DC. He has to cross the French airspace, and nobody's saying anything about it. So yes, I guess the emperor's clause, the emperor is naked, and the ICC to me is gone. There's no going back from this for the ICC. And in that sense, it's really a tragedy for international law, the international rule of law at large.
Yeah, it's very hard to get a consensus on some really important issues, and nothing is more important than, I think, to the world as to what we're seeing unfold the last 20 months in Gaza, especially because isn't that what all of these institutions were constructed to prevent after World War II? I think it is. But what you said about France was interesting. You remember the Charlie Hebdo moment where everyone rushed, all the world leaders rushed to France, arm in arm. They're all
including
there.
Netanyahu. Netanyahu was on the front row of that walk on January 11th, 2015.
Yeah,
and he held Francois Hollande and Sarkozy. Former President Sarkozy himself was part of it, walking on the second row. Yeah, I know. I remember that. So,
Yeah, so you remember that I'll bring that image up on screen, but all the world leaders converged on France. Why? Because they wanted to show their support for, the Jewish community worldwide, and of course Netanyahu, even Mahmoud Abbas, if I'm not mistaken, he
yeah,
was
you're not.
he was in the front row as well as Angela Merkel and others. Let me see if I have that that image. If we can get it real quick, we'll put it up on screen. But so, considering everything that you just said, Arnaud, about the French government taking such a hard line at anything that could be remotely considered as sympathetic towards terrorism, i.e., critical of Israel, supportive of the Palestinians or stroke Hamas, considering that, and then here it is. That's the Great Walk of Fame. All the world leaders are there. Francois Hollande, etc. Netanyahu. So if supporting terrorism is the worst thing you can do in France at the moment, and I'll get you completely raided at 5 a.m. in your flat. Well, what about this? That's the president of France embracing the head of Al Qaeda, the founder of Al Qaeda in Syria, the former deputy of al Baghdadi in ISIS. Okay, a certified head chopper that had a bounty on his head up until 7-8 weeks ago with the U.S. Department of Justice for terrorism, for slaughtering Druze, for killing American servicemen. The list goes on and on and on. And there's Macron giving him a state visit in France. Now, I spoke to some of my French colleagues, Arnaud, and a lot of them were very upset at this. They felt that this was somewhat disrespectful to the country, that the president would embrace a terrorist. It's unprecedented, Arnaud. I mean, have you ever seen anything like this? And why isn't Macron being arrested for cavorting with an actual terrorist? To be frank.
Yeah, this is the dregs. I mean, this is infamy as far as I'm concerned. But keep in mind that Al-Nusra, being the Syrian branch of Al Qaeda, basically uh, this is, this is a symbol of the organization that took out the World Trade Center towers. So the guy is being feted. I mean, we saw also Robert Ford yesterday, basically explaining how he was on a junket visit to Idlib, trying to, prep Jolani, the head chopper, into, the suit wearing master of Damascus, which was quickly denied by, the palace in Damascus. Obviously, today they jumped on it. But and the people who did, we did the Bataclan and the Charlie Hebdo, this is the same people. So this goes to tell you how morally bankrupt those Western leaders are, especially the European leaders. Their cynicism knows no bound, and to the extent they're trying to, because let's be honest here, this is all about gas pipelines. And the idea is to get into cahoot with this Turkish proxy, try to get the Turks to relent on using that migration weapon against the European Union. And essentially, try to revive the Qatar option, which would relieve the pressure on Europe, and as far as relying on Russian gas. So it's all about business. It's all about geopolitical pipeline, or pipeline geopolitics, as it were. And the possibility also for French companies to get reconstruction deals in Syria, as we saw in as far as the port of Latakia, which went to a French company. So nothing really surprising. We have a clique of mafiosos running France for quite some. I mean, it was always somewhat the case, but now it's right in the open. There's no attempt to even try to conceal it. And it's if it cost the French people a few attacks here and there, and as will most likely happen in the future again, because now with what's incubating in Syria, you can be sure that Turkey will pivot from using migration to using a bona fide terror state, all equipped courtesy of the Turkish intelligence.
Yep, yep. That should be something Europe should be worried about, because they've allowed for, first it was contained in Idlib, 35,000 terrorists led by Al-Jolani, the man embracing Macron here, the man who was platformed by Donald Trump just last week in Saudi Arabia. So, but they're no longer hemmed into Idlib, Arnaud. They've got almost a whole country. They've established an Islamic State in Syria. It was the very thing that everybody seemed to want to prevent all those years ago, but I don't think they were serious. They got what they wanted, and that brings us to this here. We'll bring this up on screen. The reality here is this, and this is the reality, Arnaud. Donald Trump, by platforming Al-Jolani, who is a terrorist, who's the head of Syria, he's completed the life work of Hillary Clinton and John McCain. He is legitimizing,
yes.
and Jake Sullivan as well. We have Sullivan too. We'll bring him up on screen. That's kind of like where we're seeing it. This is James Jeffrey here, Arnaud. Al-Jolani's organization was an asset to America's strategy in Idlib. That's known. There he is, PBS Frontline. So that's a thing. And you mentioned Sullivan, of course. There's just so much documentation here. Al-Qaeda is on our side. That's 2012 email. Yeah, Al-Qaeda, Al-Jolani is on our side. So there should be no illusions as to what the real situation truly is. So what did you think when you saw this? Because I didn't think, I know Trump does some crazy things, does all these counterintuitive things, but to do the photo op with somebody who is one of the top kind of head chopping terrorists in world history, what could you possibly, does Trump know who he is, do you think? Or we know he's badly advised. Okay. Is it possible that Trump didn't know the backstory of this guy?
Well, I would like to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. But I mean, there's still fundamental information about that guy, Al-Jolani, that Trump cannot help but, be made aware of. But as you alluded to a couple of minutes ago, Trump is but the continuation of an agenda in the region, which is being carried out whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And so, to the extent he goes on a trip to the region, and he gets basically, I likened it to this kind of, you're being made. You get into the mob, you do all kind of misdeeds for a while, and if you're good at it and the circumstances are ripe, they bring you in. And now he's being, Al-Jolani is being made in that sense, or at least that's the optics. This is what it looks like. And to the extent MBS is the one who basically introduced him to Trump and said, "This is our guy. This is our man in Syria now." So it's all, to me, it makes perfect sense. It's par for the course with what's been going on ever since December 8th, 2024, when those guys rolled into Damascus. Now, the question is, you can control people like this, unless you're willing to play with fire. And this guy is now, he's essentially the Turks' man, and the Israelis, I mean, they are very aware of this. They used him, to be sure, he and his outfit, for years to try to undermine Assad. But I don't think the Israelis necessarily wanted the Assad regime gone. They were willing to work with Assad. They understood the psychology of Assad. And if they could have only wrestled him away from Iran and having him be, just your friendly dictator, so to speak, quote unquote, that would have saved the regime, I think. With what's in place now, we are entering a whole new dimension, and the Israelis are actually trying. They're scrambling right now, trying to get Trump on board in providing political cover to maybe facilitate for the Russians to stay there. But
Mhm.
the problem is the cat is out of the bag. The genie is out of the bottle. And yes, there's been discussions because states don't have any feelings; they have interests. And so the Russian Federation, to speak of them, have been trying to preserve their interest in Syria, which are by and large those two installations, the air base in Latakia and the port in Tartus. But despite all those good feelings and those conciliatory statements emanating, from Damascus, the fact is that there are very powerful actors who do not want the Russians to stay, and basically you can expect more attacks. A couple of days ago, I think the base in Nemin was attacked by
Really?
Uzbeks, foreign fighters. Yes, they came at 5 a.m. and they started throwing grenades and engaging in small fire. And so 2 Russian servicemen were killed, 5 grievously wounded. So this has been coming for a while now, going back to last December. We've had drones flying over Mnemin.
Yep.
And there's a deep-seated bad feeling, bad blood, literally bad blood between a significant chunk of those foreign fighters who, you always should keep that in mind,
Mm.
are those people who got Jolani in power. So Jolani cannot openly go against them. If anything, Jolani looked the other way as the ethnic cleansing on the coast was going on. Why? Because they were all holed up in Idlib province with their 4 wives, and you can imagine how many more kids, because they created entire tribes there for the last at least 5 years, right?
Mm.
So they wanted to get rewards. It's to the victors the spoil essentially, and this is how they think. And they use this sectarian justification to basically have the property deeds of Alawite owned businesses and homes, housing properties on the coast being shipped over to Idlib prior to the events on March 6th and on. And basically, when the so-called regime remnants attempted to, at long last, resist all the constant harassment and violences and basically act of violence against their community, this was used as a pretext by imams in Idlib and Aleppo to immediately call for the extermination of the Alawites, those infidels. I mean, the Alawites really, you have to understand, the Shia have it bad. The Christian a little bit less because they can still be converted into Islam.
Right.
But the heretics, the Alawites, and the Alawites are on top of it associated with somewhat of a secular lifestyle. I mean, they're not practicing Muslim to the extent the Shia, for instance, are perceived to be, even though Alawites are considered, as Shia themselves.
Mm.
They are waiting for the return of Imam Ali, but they're very pragmatic. They're very gifted, and they profited, from the army to elevate themselves. They were at the bottom of the pile before the Assad came in, and under the patronage of the Assad clan, they were able to reach unprecedented heights into the Syrian state. And this was resented by a lot of people, including by and large the Sunni majority. Even though, let's also be clear, the Syrian secular state and its constitution never explicitly favored one community over another. A Syrian was a Syrian was a Syrian. There was no, unlike in Israel, there was no ID card with mention of your religion. You were a Syrian, and this is gone forever now. And so, as you mentioned, yes, they went after the Kurds. There was obviously some kind of deals, half-baked deals, which were broken within days after that. Then there was, as I said, the ethnic cleansing and the resettling of all the fighters, I should say foreign fighters, from Idlib onto the coast. And as we speak now, there is literally a recomposition, demographic, ethnic cleansing, and recomposition of the Syrian coast. So in that particular context, and as far as the Russians are concerned, they're going to be soon surrounded by a Sunni extremist population.
Yeah, unfriendly.
This is not exact. Very much unfriendly.
Yeah.
And then the next stage was to go after the Druze in the south, Al-Suwaida and in Jamaraya, which is a suburb of Damascus, where a lot of Jews, and same ammo essentially. If you're not a Takfirist, if you're not part of their narrow understanding of Islam, to the extent it is Islam, you're expendable essentially. And Jolani, again, has no choice but to be true to form in that sense, because he knows that the moment he starts trying to undermine the very people on whom he wrote to Damascus, he's a dead man. So he's trying to.
It sounds like Zelensky all over again. He's a precarious leader that has been, elevated by the most extremist factions and serves at the pleasure of them plus Western powers. So I mean, just briefly, we mentioned Marco Rubio earlier, Arnaud, and just on that point. And again, no consistency from the U.S. This is March 9th. Rubio saying Syria must hold accountable perpetrators of massacres. Well, the massacres just ramped up at that point. And then you see, this scene in Riyadh, and just none of this makes any sense. But when you consider, Rubio supposedly was, somehow disturbed by the sectarian massacres by Al-Jolani here. And I mean, I didn't even want to go into the details of these, but it's unbelievable. The pogroms that are being run, but have been done, are just unbelievable. This is stuff we've never seen, Arnaud, before on this kind of, really specific, a supposed head of state executing people in the street en masse, stealing their homes and businesses, effectively erasing whole communities, and doing so pretty much in full view, Arnaud, which makes it all the more difficult to know how to react to this extreme situation, because again, a lack of rule of law in Syria, but also internationally. Instead, these Western countries are running to somehow court this person who is doing all these atrocities. I mean, it's hard to know where to go from here. And I want to play this clip by Marco Rubio as well. And I just see the level of chaos and confusion right now on policy, especially with the complex situation in Syria. Here's Marco Rubio just this week. Arnaud, I want to get your take on this.
If you look at the history of the region, when Syria is unstable, the region becomes unstable. After the Arab Spring led to the Assad rebellion against Assad, and that really destabilized the entire region. And then it turned Syria, frankly, into a playground for jihadist groups, including ISIS and others, that used it to operate and to destabilize their partners. In fact, it is our assessment that, frankly, the transitional authority, given the challenges they're facing, are maybe weeks, not many months, away from potential collapse and a full-scale civil war. It is one of the places in the Middle East where Alawis and Druze and Christians and Sunni and Shia and Kurds have lived alongside each other underneath the banner of a Syrian identity until it was broken by a butcher, Assad, who pitted them against each other.
Okay, Arnaud, I want to get it from you first. Did Assad pit Druze against Sunnis, against Alawites, against Christians? Because that's what the Secretary of State of the U.S. is saying right there. How accurate is his portrayal of recent history? And if not, what is the real story?
Well, I'm not going to comment on such statements. I mean, obviously, it's absurd on its face. How could you, I mean, if we take into account, and it's not a matter of being, fanning a fanning ball over the Assad. No regime, no government is perfect. But I mean, Syrians up until 2010 lived in a country that was self-sustained, where everybody had access to free education, free medical, could purchase a house at a very decent prices. The country was food secure. It had those oil fields in the third of the country on the northeast, which allowed it not only to sustain itself, but also have a little bit left to export. I mean, Syria under the Assad was called the Prussia of the Middle East. And incidentally, that was also something alluded to Beirut, which was called the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Yeah.
So you're seeing a pattern here is that basically starting in the 1970s, they literally gutted the region and just wanted to destroy those countries because they were well administered. I mean, not obviously according to democratic standards as some would have it in the West, but at their own pace, within their own cultural context, those people were happy. They were content. They were not lacking, the basics like today. To start with, insecurity, constant insecurity, and the fear of not knowing if you're going to make it alive by the time the day ends. This is where we are right now in Syria. But if we zoom out, the current situation is basically a redux of what we saw following the Iraqi invasion of 2003. This incubating process in the Camp Buka and Camp Victory, leading to recycled Ba'athist elements who ended up being the cadres of what was to become the Islamic State. And now we're about to see the Islamic State, which is now being very reactivated alongside the Syro-Iraqi borders. The Iraqi state is trying to do its best to kill the threat in the egg. But sooner or later, we can expect Daesh to come back, on steroids. And so Jolani might be swept out into this, but keep in mind that the illegal and unwanted U.S. presence in Syria was justified by a coalition to fight the Islamic State, which the U.S. created. So it's more of the same, essentially, and except that this time the scale is completely different, and you can now literally threaten, surrounding states into, well, you name it, normalizing with Israel. You don't normalize, we unleash the hordes. It's as simple as that. So that's basically the way I look at it. And Syria, unfortunately, God bless them, they're going to be basically undergoing what we saw in Iraq up until at least 2016, 2015, and Libya, constant chaos. And that's the way it's designed. It's actually this. It's not a failure. The idea is to sanitize the environment, the immediate surrounding of the Israeli entity, so that it can prosper on ethnic and religious division, and pull its interest out of the fire. This is the Yinon plan, the Oded Yinon plan of 1982, being put into action with the idea of creating more and more territorial expansion, and whether it's the dog wetting the tails or vice versa, I'll leave people, make their own mind on that. But in thus far as the U.S. and the Israeli state being essentially joined at the hip in as far as West Asian geopolitics, it's all good. Everything is according to plan. Is going according to plan here.
Yeah, and it's a travesty. I don't think people realize that Syria was considered by many to be a civilizational state historically, as well as being a pluralistic, a country with most democratic functions, but especially the fact that it was an Arab nationalist country, making it a huge threat to U.S. and Israeli interests. Let's face it, any stable Arab nationalist country that can't be bought or controlled, that has nationalized industries, that is self-sufficient, which, let's face it, Syria was economically self-sufficient in 2010 before the Troubles. That's agreed by all the experts, and its future was looking good. And it had very low debt. I think the Qataris just picked up the tab. The Saudis and the Qataris, so generous.
$15 million.
How much? How much?
$15 million.
$15 million. That is that's a weekend of gambling for one of the sheiks at a casino in Geneva, just to be clear. Okay. That's the national debt of Syria. What does that tell you about the Assad government? How frugal, and that they didn't take any IMF loans, Arnaud, because they didn't mortgage their future to the global central banks. And that's why he was put in the crosshairs. That's one of the main reasons here. But I'm just going to bring this map up on screen, Arnaud, and you know this country very well. You've traveled on the ground in Syria. I know it's a very special place for you and for so many other people that have visited it, especially before the Al-Qaeda, if you will, takeover in December of 2024, just a few months ago. So looking at this country, it's potentially, a lot of people are saying, Arnaud, that in Marco Rubio's, as you said, telegraphing a violent civil war, are we looking at the potential of, 4 dysfunctional statelets with maybe a slightly more functional core with Damascus at the head? We've got the coastal regions. We've got northeastern, Kurdish dominated militarily anyway, not necessarily about population. We've got Turkey has got their eye on large swaths of territory in the north, not to mention, as we said earlier, Sweda and the Druze corridor there. What could possibly develop here, Arnaud, considering what Marco Rubio has just telegraphed?
Well, let's look at it sector by sector. If we look at the coastal areas, unfortunately, as I mentioned, there's and it's still going on right now with increasing fervor, this ethnic replacement. So in the medium long term, we may actually not have an Alawite coast or Alawite dominated coast demographically, certainly not politically, but an extension of Idlib into the coast. So essentially, that will allow the Islamic fundamentalist Takfirist regime in Damascus to have a platform to project power into the Mediterranean and into Europe directly, controlling the ports. There remains, of course, the issue of the Russian presence there, but technically, this is what I'm anticipating. Within a decade, all the Alawites will be, if not killed and or evicted of the region and sent into, let's say, Lebanon as refugees, living in constant fear, and basically keeping their heads low. That's for the coast. As far as the Druze area is concerned, we may at some point see the Israeli use this as a pretext to integrate this Druze area into the corridor, the David corridor that you mentioned, which basically lounges the frontier, the border with Iraq. The idea, being to connect with what until very recently was supposed to be a Rojava entity, but And that is why actually the Israeli tried to convince the Americans not to evacuate, at least to somewhat maintain some presence there. So it seems to be going back and forth. But from what I understand recently, the Americans actually brought some convoys as well. So I don't know if they are leaving. I don't think they will maintain such a proactive interaction in as far as patrolling, and trying to contain the Turks' ambitions. They're trying to basically tell the Kurds, you're sorry, but you're on your own, but they cannot completely get out. They need to stay there at least long enough, because obviously, even though the PKK announced that they were laying down arms after a 40-year struggle and shutting down all their branches worldwide, the Turks are not going to tolerate them, and they're going to basically do what Turks do with their minorities, going back to 1915. And so it's a matter of time before the Kurds realize that, they're going to have a state, a functioning state, to defend themselves. And so this is when the Israeli, to the extent they're connecting to the David corridor, they will be able to, and this is what they want. Because within the Greater Israel project, the first border heading to the northeast of the Israeli state to come is the Rojava state. That's a friendly state. So I don't see why this Rojava project would somewhat be eluded. I think it remains down the road as relevant as ever. It's just right now we're going through readjustments, tinkering in policies, and so for now, that there are somewhat corrections in as far as the old resistance structure of the PKK, for instance, being, I guess they don't want to be giving the Turks legal reasons to go after, after them. But they understand, in that part of the world, they understand fundamentally that you are guilty by virtue of who you are, going way back. This is interesting in a way, because as an aside, and we haven't really talked about this, and this would require probably a show on its own.
Right.
But in 2020, there was a fundamental key change at the top of the intelligence apparatus in Syria. I'm talking about old Syria. And a person who was amenable to interacting with the Russians was somewhat removed in favor of a man called Usam Luka. His background is that of a Circassian.
Just to repeat that name, because we had a little latency on the stream, but just repeat the name.
Okay, Usam Luka. He became the general security head under the patronage of the former intelligence czar of Syria, Ali Mamluk, a name that you want to also have your listeners look up. And those people, disappeared after December 8, 2024. We don't know what happened. We know Mamluk was exfiltrated into Lebanon, but beyond that, we don't know what happened. And I personally doubt he remains
That's
in
the
Lebanon.
Syrian that is effectively the core of the Syrian deep state you're talking about, right?
That's right. The one who really ran things under Assad, and nothing would go on.
You got a little latency there.
Can you see me? Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. We had a little pause there, but just repeat that.
So yes, like I said, the real strong man in Syria was not Bashar al-Assad. It was Ali Mamluk. Ali Mamluk knew all the secrets, and he ran Syrian foreign policy essentially going back good 40 years. So in 2020, he promoted someone called Usam Luka, General Usam Luka, to become the head of general security. And the first thing that Usam Luka did upon being appointed was to purge all the pro-Russian personnel within the security apparatus. And if you remember, in 2018, there was an offer from Russia. That was a 25-year deal The idea was to retool the Syrian military from top to bottom, to have the future officers transported to Russia, trained in Russia, and sent back into Syria. That deal was on the table for about a couple of years, probably until 2020, when eventually it was rejected. And that was somewhat of a turning point right there, because it showed the Russian that there was no desire, at least as officially stated from Damascus, to, I wouldn't say show gratitude, but at least to engage in long-term viable compact, which could give the Syrian Republic the means to protect its political independence.
Yeah.
And what we saw after 2020 was, after following that purge of pro-Russian Syrian officers, they were sent to regional branches essentially, but Damascus was completely purged of them. What we saw was a slow pivot to, and again, Usam Luka is alleged to have played an important role. Owing to his own daughter working at the UN, he was able to get in touch with Turkish and Qatari intelligence, and hence began this pivot, this slow pivot to the Gulf state.
Away
Yeah,
from Russia towards the Gulf, right?
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
With the idea that the Gulf state would serve as intermediaries in trying to lobby the United States and the Western countries, the European Union, to lift the sanctions and to normalize with Syria,
Right.
with the results that we know, obviously. This could help explain why Damascus dragged its feet when Russia attempted to sponsor high-level talks, for instance, with Erdogan. This was crystallized by the appointment of Bashar al-Jafari as extraordinary ambassador of the Syrian Republic to the Russian Federation. He was to have been the guy basically coordinating the talks with the Turks at the highest level. Mind you, this is before the Turkish presidential election of 2023, when Erdogan felt somewhat vulnerable during the campaign owing to the economic pressure caused by those upward to 4 million Syrian refugees living in Turkey. So he wanted to basically send those significant chunk of those refugees back into Syria, and he wanted to somehow strike a deal with Assad. And Assad basically relented. He wanted, as a pre-existing condition, for the Turks to unilaterally withdraw their troops from Syria. And in a region where basically it's all about showing strength, it's somewhat understandable that, because you have to understand that Assad also has to face its own deep state, its own radicals and people who are probably working double agendas within his first circle. So he could not possibly be perceived as a weak leader who would basically allow the Turks to, lead him around by the nose and dictate the conditions of any kind of rapprochement. Fact is, and it's all about perception, is the Russians were somewhat very annoyed by this, because the Russians wanted to resolve this politically according to 2254. Remember, 2254 was the framework. And so that, and not to mention all the work, the legwork that had been implemented going back to 2016 with the Astana framework.
Right.
So it was all culmination, that basically never led to anything. And in the wake of this sequence being basically unproductive, let's put it this way, that's when basically Erdogan decided to activate a by then reinvigorated, I would say, incubation vial in Idlib, who by then had received instructions and formation from the Ukrainians, who felt like it would be useful and valuable to them to undermine the Russian Federation's interest in Syria by providing formation to the jihadists in the drone warfare. And the drone will never overstate it. Was the drone ability to basically serve as an air force for al-Nusra in covering those large swaths, of the Syrian territories, basically flat areas with no cover whatsoever. And so they were able to inflict, basically sow panic within Syrian ranks. If you add to this the fact that, the Caesar sanctions were really biting by 2024, with, the currency in free fall, 90% of the population, this is in the report produced by Alana Douan, the special rapporteur on the coercive nature of unilateral sanctions, explains in detail. 90% of the Syrian population lived under the threshold, the threshold of poverty, and the officers in the Syrian army were getting paid. I mean, a general in the Syrian army was getting $30 a month.
Yeah.
So it was a long sequence which allowed to lay the ground, to make the ground fertile for then billions of dollars, probably paid by the Qataris, to be put into suitcases and distributed at key areas within the Syrian military and intelligence flowchart, with the result that we saw. So this is so going back to Luca, an interesting thing, since we were talking about who you are, defined by who you are and who your family and your tribes are. Luca is a Sunni Muslim whose family most likely escaped the Caucasus areas back in the 17th century when Imperial Russia was expanding into this area. They came into contact with Circassian. The Circassian wanted to somewhat convince the Tsar to be their guy, their go-to guy in the region, and their enforcer locally. The Tsar didn't want any of that. The Tsar wanted to Russify. So obviously things came to a head, and there was problems, and a lot of those Circassian ended up fleeing to the then Ottoman Empire, which included Syria. So it's interesting somehow that this guy was being brought under the patronage of Ali Mamluk to assume the duties of the general security. First thing he does is to purge all the pro-Russian officers. One has to assume that his family history is not an estranged factor to such a course of action. Which goes to say that, yeah,
it sounds like something British intelligence would have dreamt up, to be quite frank, or French intelligence. But how they think about, or maybe Turkish intelligence as well. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Arnaud. Go ahead.
No. You're right. I was finished. Actually, no, you're right. That's exactly what they would have done, because they understand the region. They understand the bloodlines. It's all about bloodlines. It's all about the sins of the fathers, and it's all about seeking revenge. And in whichever particular context, when you zoom in, you're talking about. We're talking about cycles. Could be 20-year cycles here, 100-year cycles there, but it's all about recurring events and waging, and dealing with long-standing feuds, essentially intractable, deeply seated, simmering feuds. And now, basically, the Turks, in that sense, are only, setting the record straight as far as their perceived humiliation following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. They are on the ascendancy again, so to speak. And so everybody who, in the meantime, for those 100 years of humiliation, is perceived to have, gone against the grain are now being dealt accordingly. So if we look at it as Westerners, of course, those things that are going on in Syria now are horrible and reprehensible to the hilt. But if you understand how religious and ethnic antagonism and rivalries have been dictating local geopolitics in that region, you're starting seeing patterns emerging, if not re-emerging, repeating themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And understanding the Ottoman Empire and how they governed and how administration was done is very important, and how the Ottomans managed all of these different groups. Syria, for people who aren't aware of what Syria is, and I only had, limited time there during the war, but 5 weeks approximately, but longer than most BBC reporters, I can tell you. But what I learned, Arnaud, it's one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse countries in the world. Actually, there are more different tribal and ethnic groups historically in that country, relatively small space, than as much or more than any other place in the world. So that level of diversity, how was that managed by the Ottoman Empire? There was a caste system, kind of an unofficial caste system where everybody kind of had their place, and this is how affairs were managed. When the breakup of the Ottoman Empire happened, mostly at the behest of the British and the French, obviously, they made a lot of promises to different people that after the First World War, you will have your own state, you will have this, you will have that. And instead, the British and the French went behind everybody's back and basically stabbed them all back and split the whole lot up between themselves. Basically, that's just a little pretty quick summary. And Turkey became the state of Turkey, but still retained its Ottoman identity in certain ways, and its history and the legacy as well. And then that legacy, that impulse, is reemerging under Tayyip Erdogan and the AKP party. So I want to ask you this, Arnaud, and maybe we could talk all day. I want to give you the floor to finish off your analysis. But before you do that, Arnaud, I want you to answer me this question. When we see an image like this, it's all about perspective, as you said, Arnaud. So when we see a picture like this, Arnaud, is this Tayyip Erdogan betraying Bashar al-Assad, or is this Bashar al-Assad being naive as to the larger, wide-ranging geopolitical forces at play, or is that the wrong question? What are your thoughts on when you see a photo like this, Arnaud?
It's neither. Both men, even though there's a difference in age, both men understand. It's in their blood. It's in their family history. They understand the ramification, and they understand that basically they cannot trust what either one of them is saying to the other, and that everything is subject to requalification at a whim. So it's a snake pit. It's a snake pit, and it's first and foremost the politics of survival. And so you have to maintain a very delicate equilibrium. It's like walking on a fine line constantly. And this explains why a lot of those people, including Bashar al-Assad's father, died of, I think, liver cancer, because, not only was he exposed to the realities we merely touched on, regionally speaking, but also within Syria. Let's recall that within his own clan, within his own family, his own brother attempted to depose him in 1984, and that failed. And again, we would need to have probably an entire show to go over the 60-year Assad rule. But contrary to popular belief, it was anything but a picnic, as far as Hafez al-Assad was concerned. And he suffered, attempted coup from his own midst. and it came down to a showdown actually, where some of the militaries basically rallied behind him, but there was still his brother, Rifat al-Assad. Rifat al-Assad had built a state within a state, literally. He controlled all the traffic. He was almost like the Ben Ali of his time. There was not one business going on unless he knew about it, and he took his cut from it. I mean, I met people in the Western region, on the coast, in the mountains west of Homs. There are a lot of Christian villages interspersed with Alawite villages, and so you can walk like 15 minutes from one village to the next. And I walked into this village, which I found out had been suffering the brunt of the general security, the new general security of HTS, with horrible results, by the way. But I met a man there from a very poor social background. I mean, his house was made of tow. There was no furniture. They were basically eating on the floor. So, this goes to the idea that the Alawites basically were living la vida loca. There's nothing could be further from the truth. A lot of Alawites lived very, very meekly. And if we want to talk about those two individuals I referred earlier, Ali Mamluk and Usam Luka, they were Sunnis. They were not Alawites. So again, the notion that all the key positions in the apparatus of the Syrian deep state were occupied by Alawites is hogwash again. But I remember, having tea with the guy, and I was working at the time with on a tax case. I had been asked to provide a legal note on appeal for Hafez al-Assad's brother, Bashar's uncle, who lived in Paris from 1985 to 2021, when Bashar essentially pardoned him and told him, you can come back and finish off your life here. Just don't meddle into politics, please, this time around. But he allowed him to come back. And I guess they're all in Moscow now, by the way. But this guy, yes, so when I mentioned that to him, almost in passing, suddenly his eyes just illuminated, because a lot of those people on the Western coast, they were all their needs, all their livelihood was provided by Rifat al-Assad, the would-be next president of Syria, the one who would depose his own brother, the founder of the Syrian Arab Republic from 1970 on. And so, and you understood, that it's all about sticking to your own tribe, your own clan, your own sect. They call it sect there. And even though the guy, basically never saw all those glitzy lifestyle, but at some point back in the 80s, when he was a kid, his family was taken care of by Rifat al-Assad, and again, this is on the smaller scale time wise, but it really illustrates the loyalty is very important in those countries. You don't deviate, you don't go out of the group, the sect. You might intermarry, and we saw a lot of that under the Assad clan administration. But by and large, it was not the norm. Sunnis stick with Sunnis, Alawite with Alawites, etc., etc. And then, owing to again historical reasons, you would have like rapprochement between certain communities, like the Christians and Alawites were close, going back to the Ottoman Empire. They had to strike alliances, and but the Sunnis were, the majority Sunni was living, there was no discrimination per se, as far as all the things that characterized the old Syria, as far as getting a house, access to education, access to military training, access to medical care. But it was always a very fragile balancing act, and almost like a veneer, almost like a Camelot era. Which required, of course, a strong man, because only a strong man at some point has to be the guarantor of national unity.
Yep.
This is how you have to understand the rule of the Assad, and a lot could be said about Saddam Hussein as well. Saddam Hussein administered a country which was Shia majority, with Kurdish population, a substantial Kurdish population in the north. But he also managed to be first and foremost the guarantor of the state. Once you remove those quote unquote strong men, as we saw in Yugoslavia, with the removal, or at least not the removal, but the passing of Tito. When Tito was gone, it was the beginning of the end. Tito died in 1989. 2 years later, Western services had applied pressure on those century-long fault lines, which were but dormant under Joseph Broz Tito. And the same thing happened in West Asia with Saddam Hussein or the Assads. It's the same thing.
With the family dynasty there on screen, Arnaud, see a few familiar faces, some new, some older. But Hafiz al-Assad there, as you said, the father of the Syrian Arab Republic, sitting down there next to his wife, and it's a tragic story as well. Untimely deaths, the succession of power took a strange turn at times, and what happened, I think, was just one of the greatest tragedies, really, in modern history. Was what we're watching now, Arnaud, is we're watching the dismemberment of a once regarded as a once great state, but not just that. It was one of the only independent Arab republics that stood steadfast in defending the Palestinian cause. And that is not insignificant. And I think that is also one of the things that gets overlooked, certainly pro-Israel people and, a lot of neoconservatives and so forth. That's why they regarded Syria as public enemy number one in the region, because of their patronage and their support for the Palestinian cause and various political organizations, as well. So that's it's a complicated story, but it's so often mischaracterized, and a lot of people say a lot of things that don't correspond to reality at all, especially when it comes to Syria. We've seen a lot of this between October 7th and then the Al-Qaeda terrorist junta in December takeover in Damascus. A lot of distortion of narratives and accusations about what Bashar al-Assad did or didn't do against Israel, for the Palestinians, etc. But at the end of the day, it was a bulwark against imperialism, and
it was. It's almost, in a way. I mean, you almost feel privileged to have known this period of Syrian history, because there's no going back. This is gone forever, and so it presents itself as some kind of lore. A 60-year period. I mean, it's nothing. Damascus, the city of Damascus, and Aleppo are two of the longest existing inhabited settlement in world history. I mean, Syria, in Damascus alone, if you go to the Mosque of the Umayyad, you have the tomb of John the Baptist with his head there. You have the tomb of Hussein, who was one of the greatest imam in Shiism. You step out of the mosque, you walk around it 50 meters on the right, and there's the mausoleum of Salah al-Din, who defeated the Crusaders. So this is, I mean, and next to all this, I mean, a stone throw away, you have the Christian quarter, Bab Touma, where, on any given night, especially on the weekend, you would not see the difference between, with a Western capital. in as far as nightlife is concerned. Well, all this is gone now. I mean, what I'm hearing, all the reports that I'm getting every day, is that people are depressed. I mean, Umayyad Square today, somebody sent me a footage. You just saying like uh, all the lights have been taken out. All what made it, they had this way of embellishing buildings, a sense of aesthetics that you don't find anymore now. The country, I mean, the city is thrown in, entire areas, quarters of the city are thrown into darkness pretty early. And it's all about, people just almost shuffling alongside the walls, going to whatever, minding their business. But all that joy, either it's gone, or to the extent that there are people who are trying to, it's a traumatized society. It's PTSD after 14 years. And I hear a lot of people basically congratulating themselves in as far as what happened, because they were expecting the end of the long-standing nightmare and maybe the reintegration of the country into the world economy. And people think about, of course, bettering a better life for themselves and their families. It's understandable. But you get the notion now after 5 months that it's just it's almost like, it sounds like a mechanical, like a mantra, but you see less and less Syrian making podcast or going live and somehow expressing a sense of rejoicing. This honeymoon was very short-lived, it seems to me. But you have to survive, and you have to be careful there, because general security is constantly on the prowl. And again, owing to who you are, if you don't say the right things, or sometimes for no reason at all, because again, the economy is in tatter. The relief, to the extent the sanction, the Europeans have announced en banc lifting of the sanction. How does that reconcile, for instance, with the fact that Rubio specified that the State Department could only provide waivers for 6 months on specific items?
Yeah.
Short of a congressional bill reversing all the legislation that has been adopted against Syria, including the Caesar Act, which basically sanctions any country that would remotely engage and normalize economically with Syria. So that means technically that unless Congress passes a law that invalidates Caesar law, the Europeans are potentially putting themselves in the crosshair of the United States if they were to, So it's really, it's a mess. It's not going to be like just like that overnight lifting of sanctions and next thing it's one thing to pay $15 million to pay the bill, the debt that Syria allegedly incurred in order to open up assistance from the IMF. But what does that tell you when you hear IMF? It's you're going to be in servitude, you're going to be indebted. And so this is what's going to happen. The country is going to indebt itself through those usual suspects. I'm channeling John Perkins here all over again. And it's going to profit only a few well-positioned firms, most likely close to the Department of Defense in the US, and some private security firms, people like that. That's who's going to. But the regular man on the street is not going to see the color of it.
No. If you want to, you're so right, Arnaud, and they'll have to sell all of their agriculture products on the global market for the highest price. You'll have food shortages at home. They'll need imported food aid by the UN, food for oil program, all that garbage. If you want to look at the future of Syria's economy, the best possible scenario is that it will become like Lebanon. Okay, it'll just be basically dependent on foreign finance, loans and somehow, promises of development, but never quite getting there. And then this huge NGO class that basically provides jobs for the middle class and anyone with a university degree. And then, a dysfunctional central government that's not very effective and constantly at war and sectarian to the nth degree. That's Lebanon. That's the Lebanese model, and the West love it. The United States they love what they've created in Lebanon, as do the Europeans, because they're not able to exert any sovereignty or any influence over, especially over their neighbors, Israel, especially. So that's the best possible scenario, Arnaud. But I don't think they're going to reach the level of Lebanon, because Lebanon had that pedigree of being the Switzerland of the Middle East, which it in fact was for a period of time. Syria does not have that pedigree, especially from this war over the last 15 or so years. They're so far behind now that it's a third world country. Basically, it went from being a second, almost a first world, second world. Now it's a bona fide third world country, Syria, and sliding in some cases even further down from that, because it's obviously embroiled in sectarian warfare. I just remember being here, Arnaud. You'll recognize this place here. This is a famous arcade in Damascus, and the best ice cream in the world is sold here.
Yes.
I forgot the name. It's Bagdish. I can't remember the name of that shop, but there's long queues.
The market is Ahmadiyya market, I think.
Yeah.
It's near the Umayyad Mosque. Yes.
And I walked all those trails of St. Paul, and stopped at all the different religious sites throughout the city. And so, I walked Damascus while I was there for the free time that I did have. I had a combination of, service taxis and walking, but it's definitely different now. It's definitely going to take on a different tone. It's not going to be quite the same. And the memory of this family is being more or less erased, literally. Graves being dug up, right? Everything's being taken down. And not only that,
I've forgotten about that. Yes, it was awful. And I visited this mausoleum. In Kardaha, yes, it's in the northern part of Latakia region, which is the stronghold of the Alawites. Jableh, Banias. It's a beautiful coastline, and Kardaha is the hometown of the Assad. There's about 4 Alawite families, very influential families who live there. And the Assad were based in Kardaha. And so the mausoleum, the Hafez al-Assad, founding president, Hafez al-Assad's mausoleum was there. Next, his tomb was next to that of Bashar al-Assad's late brother, Basil, the one who was supposed to have been president until his untimely death in 1994. And the other side of the grave is the grave of his wife, who's sitting next to him. And so when we saw those barbarians, let's put it this way, just literally digging, and taking the remains, I guess the bones, I don't know. This is who runs Syria now. Well, I call them cannibals. That's what they remind me of those French Jacobins, in the Vendée area back in 1792, going on depredation raids and opening a pregnant woman up, and those such niceties like this. Those are cannibals, and that's who the West is in cahoots now. And if the West thinks they're going to be able to keep them at bay and control them, I got a bridge to sell you. We've created something that we managed to have al-Nusra and all the likes succeed in Syria where they failed in Iraq. So they have an entire state. They have the Turkish military intelligence who's providing them equipment, intel, and they're going to be used. I mean, those guys knows that they owe everything they have to Turkey. And Turkey is going to weaponize Syria against the West to obtain all kind of things.
Yeah,
It's
that's
going to be a destabilizing factor for decades to come. Until maybe, unless and until we kind of see something that we saw between 2014 and 2019, when the resistance, there was a regional, homegrown coalition of forces who united their effort to try to jugulate and exterminate this hydra. But with what happened the last year alone, with Nasrallah being gone, Soleimani in 2020, Mohandes in 2020, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. You don't replace men, of that magnitude overnight. Which is not to say there are not some of them waiting in the wings, but it takes time to build charisma.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu said it himself when he mentioned Nasrallah, almost with a hint of respect, which, in a way, to the extent Netanyahu can have respect for anybody, I detected something that somewhat resembled to it, when he evoked Nasrallah's legacy. But make no mistake, yes, they remain a force, but with Syria being out of the picture, the axis is essentially sectioned off. They actually intercepted a shipment of anti-tank shells, missile shells at the Syrian-Iraqi border yesterday. So it's increasingly going to be difficult for Hezbollah to recover, its potency. And without, the leadership, the charismatic leadership of Nasrallah, it's just not the same. It's just not the same anymore.
No. Not only that, any potential negotiation partner, any potential, person acting as a statesman, like Hassan Nasrallah, like any of the former Palestinian political delegation, they've all been killed. They've all been assassinated. So Israel can just
it all
say,
started almost a year ago with the Raisi incident, which was somewhat very dodgy when you start looking at it up close and personal. Yes,
extremely.
And from then on, they on June 14th they took out Haniyeh, who was in Tehran to attend the intronization of the new Iranian president. Then fast forward September with Nasrallah on 24th during the General Assembly, if you recall. There was supposed to have been, there was a word, I think, that was given that, there was a truce. But somehow Netanyahu used that, and basically betrayed the term of the truce and provided the intel, the go-ahead upon getting the coordinates from the UN building at the General Assembly. He ordered the assassination of Nasrallah and all of his entourage. And then we had the Sin War, the head of the military wing of Hamas. So, and not to mention an assortment of senior level ground commanders from all the resistance component, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas. So, in 1 year, the configuration has completely shifted.
Yep.
And of course, the downfall of Assad.
Only Yemen seems to remain
yes.
somewhat coherent in their command structure and increasing their military capabilities incrementally over time. So, but it's quite the results are there for everyone to see. The results are Gaza. That's the results, because this is why the Axis coalesced together to try to prevent what we are seeing in Gaza. And this is why Yemen takes the straight position it does on the issue, because of Gaza. So that's the true lens to look at events, but the Western lens doesn't look at it through that. The Western lens is terrorist, our ally Israel. That's it. That's the geopolitics. That's the equation. And then we need to eliminate the problem, like, a raid, extermination, pest control mentality, which the imperialist Israeli mentality is that, basically. And they've managed to dehumanize their unfriendly, what they call their unfriendly neighbors in the region, and given them license. The U.S. has given them license to do whatever they want to make that happen, and will assist them in any way possible. That's where we're at. That's the status quo. But it's important to understand the full context. I think we've just touched on some interesting, really important points, and especially perhaps we'll reconvene, Arnaud, at a future time to discuss the timeline of events historically on Syria over with the downfall of the government in December. And you brought up some very interesting points. It's, I think, an interesting story.
It's important, I think, to be very nuanced about what happened. And I know a lot of people have been quick and prompt to blame Russia, if anything, for having turned its back on Syria. It's not exactly the way it happened. And so, some people might be feeling nostalgic about thinking maybe even that the Syrian state was not at fault, but unfortunately, Bashar al-Assad was, I don't know, tired, exhausted, the power, running a country and having to basically be one of the key member of a regional mechanism, i.e. the resistance axis, can take a lot of toll on one man. And he's but a man at the end of the day. He's not a superman. He was thrown into that wall somewhat against his predisposition. He was fated to be an eye doctor in London when he met his wife. And next thing you know, they are catapulted into the international limelight, and they have to learn fast. And because if you don't adapt quickly, you can be out of the game, and I mean physically out.
Yeah.
And love of country, he loved this country, he loved these people. He took it upon himself to perpetuate what his father had started, and he probably genuinely hoped that he would manage to navigate through those swamp that the West kept throwing at him. But at the end of the day, they were key moments, which I guess with this episode receding in history, we'll have more distance and we'll be able to write more informed accounts of what transpired. You mentioned earlier during the show I think one of the first opportunity to finish off the job in Idlib. Why wasn't this taken on? Why was there hesitancy? Should we really take at face value Donald Trump's veiled threat not to allow the so-called genocide of 3 million people in Idlib, which is ridiculous? Especially when you see how the Russians are cautiously, proceeding in Ukraine, not using,
and how they cautiously proceeded in East Aleppo.
Yeah, exactly.
Very surgical, completely meticulous.
So was the change at the top of the security, military, intelligence apparatus within the Syrian deep state? Was that already an expression of that change at the top?
Legitimate question. Yeah.
Where to the extent they were in contact with the Turks, they might have been swayed by the Turks not to touch Idlib.
100%. Yeah, that's a big part of it, by the way, and I need to do more investigation into that. But I think promises were made by Turkey that they would deal with the terrorists in Idlib, but they
That's
obviously
right.
had no
No,
intention
of
to.
course not.
Yeah.
No.
But doing the normal Erdogan, we call him the dervish. He is the great ballerina, and he does
Yes.
pirouettes, and he is the master of pirouetting. So wonderful, dazzling.
But to be sure, I mean, that sequence, we're like late 2019. We're not just dealing with East Aleppo, but the entire Aleppo agglomeration has been liberated. There's a speech on TV by Bashar al-Assad in November 2019. And then the next thing you know, yes, there's that kind of still sequence where you can go in and finish off, and somehow it doesn't happen. What was the content of the last conversation that Soleimani had at the palace prior to fly to Baghdad to meet his fate? Was there a heated discussion? Was Soleimani trying to push that point to Assad, and to no avail? To the extent someone with Soleimani's stature was somewhat game planned or checked. Who did the checking? Who got Assad's ears to prevent him to dissuade him from sticking with Soleimani, which up to that point had been really successful for Syria. And Soleimani enjoyed a very large aura, if not charisma, as a military commander and a strategist. So there's a lot that, between November 2019 and let's say January 3rd, 2020, because with the deaths of Mohandes and Soleimani, that this Idlib thing is pretty much it's filed away. The decision has been made not to finish off. So we're in a configuration of a frozen conflict. Then next thing you know, in December 2019, Congress passes the Caesar Act. And we can talk about the circumstances that saw the Caesar Act. I was involved in this in Syria with the Minister of Justice. The predicate of what motivated, what made possible the adoption of the Caesar Act is a big hoax. Yep. One day I will write a book about this. All those pictures were not pictures of torturees. They were pictures of ISIS fighters whose pictures had been taken at the morgue to document them. And we were able to prove all this, and we would have been able to prove it in a court of law. Fact is, in the context of what I somewhat described with that change at the top, and even though the Russians had sent specialists to assist us in promoting and prepare a briefing to the National Security Bureau in Damascus, this proposal, this legal avenue was never followed up. So the question again is why not call into question the Caesar when we understand, looking back, the importance that the Caesar law had over the 4 years, the next 4 or 5 years in reducing the will to fight to nothing, essentially, and aggravating the conditions, the living condition of Syrians, including Syrians in the military, so that when Erdogan decided to activate his proxies in Idlib, he met no opposition, essentially. So it's all connected. It's all connected.
Yeah, and by the way, we I hope you do write that book, Arnaud. And the report itself, the Caesar report, 100%, just from my understanding and research, the American gentleman who organized that direct links to the CIA, to U.S. intelligence. So this was clearly a very sophisticated intelligence operation, much like the Magnitsky story, which was used to create Magnitsky sanctions, which was a new raft or category of sanctions very similar to the Caesar Act, and that's using Russia and the Magnitsky story. Sergei Magnitsky is the predicate. This was Bill Browder's lawyer, and
accountant.
His accountant. This story has been well proven to be absolutely fraudulent by a number of different journalists and filmmakers. So it's amazing how our geopolitics and the legal frameworks have been structured through hoaxes, effectively giant political hoaxes that have been weaponized and turned into legislation in the West, and then used to strangle countries, basically, and create political pressure and leverage. I mean, this is an important topic. Certainly, we can throw a lot of things into that, including the Skripal story. I'll throw that in there as well as the
MH17.
MH17, the Litvinenko incident as well, and the list goes on. There's just quite a few different examples of this. This bag of tricks, as we like to call it, this bag of tricks has been deployed. It's caused so much death and destruction and suffering for people in these countries, Syria being one of the worst. So I personally take umbrage to all the virtue signaling that I see from people, including Marco Rubio, over this issue right now, making up their own version of history for the cameras. And that means the policy is not going to work, by the way. What we're learning is that your policies need to be informed by truth. And you have to be honest about the history. Only then can you build the foundations of things that make sense. And unfortunately, that's not happening with the United States in particular. Arnaud Develay, thank you for joining us on the Midweek Wire. This has been a little bit of an extended discussion. I think it's worth it. I think this is important to discuss these, to air out what we think is a much closer version of history than the one that is often the consensus reality version in the mainstream. But thank you, Arnaud, political consultant, author, also international human rights lawyer as well. Thank you for joining us this week on the Midweek Wire.
Thank you, Patrick.
And there he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Arnaud Develay. Follow him on social media, and we'll have his links down in the description. But you also see Arnaud's work at 21stcenturywire.com, which will be on his archive. And this, as well as this program, will be filed under that archive as well. You can access that at 21stcenturywire.com and also learn more about his other work, including his book, Foreign Entanglements, which is also out and about, and it's definitely one worth reading as well. You can catch that on Amazon with Clarity Press and some other finer booksellers. So listen, that's all we got time for today. Listen, folks, it's been real. Appreciate you guys. We'll be back on Sunday with the Sunday Wire with another great episode this weekend. So that's on 12 till 3 Eastern time, 5 till 8 UK time. That's myself and the team at ACR. Maybe a guest, if we're lucky. We might get an update from the Gaza flotilla with one of the members of that team. Hopefully you'll come on with us on Sunday. That's also a very important story. But that's where we're at, ladies and gentlemen. We have no more to offer you this midweek, but do keep an eye on our channels for new things and additions, which are coming. Again, take care. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen, and I'll leave you with our great friend, the wonderful artist Peyote for President. You Are the Revolution is his track. We'll see you on Sunday. Take care, you guys.
You are the revolution. commodity. You are the revolution. And we're gaslit into another war. Stand strong, because you are the revolution.
You are the revolution.
You are the revolution. You are the revolution. You are the revolution that you've been waiting for. You are the revolution. You are the revolution. You are the revolution. They conspire against you, accuse you of terrorism, to steal your sovereignty. Hold fast, watch it collapse. But just stop. I know that we still have the power. You are the revolution. They want to centralize, monopolize, control your thoughts. Breathe, go deep, go outside, put seeds in the ground. You are not alone. You are not alone. You are the revolution that you've been waiting for. You are the revolution that you've been waiting for. Alone. You are the revolution that you've been waiting for.
You are the revolution.
You are not alone. That you've been waiting for.
Oh, hi. Is this a trend to the revolution?
Why, yes, my lady. And you're right on time.